Wonderful. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar hosted by BCHR, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. My name is Anthony Hu. I was a researcher for BCHR, and I have the distinct pleasure of hosting and moderating this event. I want to start off by thanking everyone for joining us today for this important conversation about the state of press freedom in Bahrain and around the world. Of course, we gathered here today to celebrate Press Freedom Day, which took place just 2 days prior to this. And as you know, the unabated flow of information and ideas are vital to inclusive and tolerant society, especially when those opinions are dissenting or differ from that of the government. In this way, the respect for freedom of expression and for the freedom of the press is the cornerstone of any human rights abiding country. In 2022, however, Bahrain faces a number of challenges to free press and the freedom of expression overall, some of which have persisted from previous years, but others have emerged as Bahrain evolved in the past year. To discuss these challenges more in depth, we have an excellent panel joining us today, and I want to take a few moments to introduce everyone. Our first guest is Justin Shilad, who is the Committee to Protect Journalists Senior Middle East and North Africa researcher, and joined the organization as a research associate in 2017. He previously worked as an editor and freelance reporter, including at the Egypt Independent in Cairo, and assisted in the resettlement of refugees in Egypt and Kenya. Justin has a bachelor's degree from American University in Washington, D.C., and a master's degree from Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Next, we have Salwa Ghazouani, who is the regional director for the Middle East and North Africa at Article 19. She has over 16 years of experience working in NGOs and multilateral organizations, including the UNDP in Tunisia and the Center for Arab Women in Training and Research. Ms. Salwa holds a Master of Science in Information Communication from the Institute of Press and Information Sciences in Tunisia. And prior to joining Article 19 in 2012, she led the organization's programs on freedom of expression, media reform, and access to information in Tunisia, but also in the Middle East and North Africa region. And then we have Matthew Redding, who currently oversees campaigning and advocacy on freedom of expression information issues at the Global Campaign Strategist for IFEX. He has previously worked in the nonprofit and academic sectors and has focused on atrocity prevention, security sector reform in post-conflict and transitioning states. And he holds a master in global governance from the Balzili School of International Affairs. And last but not least, Karen Karliker is the director of PEN America's Free Expression at Risk programs. And she leads PEN America's assistance to individuals at risk as a result of their expression and an ongoing partnership with PEN Myanmar. She has almost 2 decades of experience in global free expression, press freedom, and digital rights issues, as well as advocacy and assistance work on behalf of writers, bloggers, and journalists. Prior to joining PEN America, she worked as director of Freedom House's Freedom of the Press Project, an editor for Economist Intelligence Unit, and a consultant for Human Rights Watch. She also served on the governing council and the board of International Freedom of Expression Exchange IFEX network. She holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Indian History from Cambridge University and a Bachelor of Arts from Vassar College. So thank you all for taking the time to join us today. We'll jump right into your interventions before going into our Q&A for this event. Justin, if you would like to start us off, please go ahead.
Sure, absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Anthony, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Bahrain Center for hosting this event. And a belated happy Press Freedom Day to everyone, and also Eid Mubarak to everyone who's celebrating. I want to start out real quick by just giving a brief overview about the work that the Committee to Protect Journalists does, and a little overview of the press freedom situation, talk about press freedom specifically as it applies to Bahrain, and then I'll wrap up my intervention by tying that into regional and global trends that we're seeing. So to start with, the Committee to Protect Journalists was founded in 1981. Our mission is to document press freedom violations and defend the rights of journalists worldwide. And our core research documentation work that we do is tracking the numbers of journalists who are killed and imprisoned for their work, as well as doing more in-depth research into a broad array of press freedom violations that we see worldwide. So last year, as of December 1st, 2021, there were 293 journalists jailed worldwide, which is a new record and a global high since we started taking those statistics. As of that same date, there were 6 journalists who were imprisoned in Bahrain. Since then, we've received news of at least 1 journalist who was released, Ahmed Hamidan. But unfortunately, that still leaves 5 journalists behind bars and increasingly facing very difficult conditions in detention. We've also seen over the past decade, since the first protest in February 2011, we've seen the imprisonment of journalists being part of a broader escalating crackdown on press freedom that has ultimately almost completely silenced any independent critical media in Bahrain and led to a very dire situation there in terms of press freedom. And we've seen that not only with the imprisonment of journalists, but also with the killing of journalists without accountability in 2011, 2012, and with ongoing and increasing use of spyware and surveillance technology, not only in Bahrain, but in the region. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. To start with, to give a brief overview on the situation of imprisoned journalists, what we've seen is journalists being sentenced to long periods of time behind bars, almost all the time on spurious charges, including charges that they had, quote, joined terror cells and all sorts of other charges related to anti-state charges or undermining the security and stability of the kingdom. It is a very common tactic that we see in Bahrain, as we do see elsewhere in the region. And it is an attempt by the authorities to paint any critical independent journalism as a threat to the safety and stability of the country. What we've also seen is a very troubling trend too, is that of these journalists who have been sentenced to prison, at least 3 of them have also had their Bahraini nationality revoked too, which is, at least in my research, fairly unprecedented in the region and is a very, very worrying development. Specifically talking about some of the cases that we've documented, what we've seen is that for journalists behind bars, they have faced increasingly dire conditions, brutal treatment, and a denial of timely access to medical care. One of the most prolific cases among those is the case of Dr. Abdul Asinkes, who, as of yesterday, passed his 300th day on hunger strike. He had been on hunger strike since last year, protesting his lack of access to critical medical treatment, as his health has deteriorated seriously behind bars in recent years. This has been an ongoing trend in practice for Bahraini authorities for years in terms of how they treat detained journalists. And his situation is particularly worrying due to his already existing health conditions and also due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. One thing about the pandemic over the past couple of years is that it has thrown into sharp relief how bad Bahrain's prison conditions are and how negligent the authorities can be in making sure journalists have access to treatment. We saw that also with Ahmed Hamidan, who was recently released this year, who for years behind bars had an eye infection that was not treated, which left him in danger of blindness. And more recently, he also contracted COVID-19 behind bars. The spread of COVID-19 in Bahrain and its threat to imprisoned journalists and the imprisoned population in Bahrain overall was actually also documented behind bars by Mahmoud al-Jaziri, who was serving a prison sentence in Bahrain in relation to his journalistic work, who, while behind bars, reported on the lack of COVID-19 containment measures and hygiene measures to stop the spread of the disease in 2020, when the pandemic first started, and was subsequently put in solitary confinement by the Bahraini authorities as punishment. So this gives an overview of how Bahrain has imprisoned journalists and then also continues to retaliate them when they're behind bars. And there should be no mistake about this. This does send a message to journalists who are outside the prison walls as well of what could await them if they fall on the wrong side of the authorities. Additionally, I think one thing that's very important to focus on too is the ongoing impunity for the deaths of journalists in Bahrain. According to CBJ's research, there have been at least 3 journalists who have been killed for their work in Bahrain in 2011, 2012. And while the number of journalists killed in relation to their work in Bahrain is lower than what we may see in, say, Syria and Iraq, the number in proportion to the size of Bahrain's overall population and the complete impunity and disregard for human life that has been shown by the ruling regime in these cases is very instructive. 2 of these deaths occurred in April 2011 within days of each other. Zakaria Rashid Hassan al-Ashiri and then Karim Fakhraoui. Both of them died in detention at the hands of Bahraini authorities. Zakaria was arrested from his home in April 2011 and was beaten to death in Bahraini custody a few days later. There were 5 policemen tried who were put on trial ostensibly for his death, and all were acquitted. And then just a couple of days later was the death of Karim Fakhraoui, who was the founder of the Al-Wasat, the last remaining independent newspaper in Bahrain, which was shuttered in 2017. He went to the police station to complain about an order to demolish his house. He was detained at the police station and was later reportedly tortured to death. There were 2 police officers who were sentenced to 7 years in prison over his death, but that was reduced to 3 years on appeal. And then a year later was the death of Ahmed Ismail Hassan, who was documenting a protest in Bahrain. After police and security forces dispersed the protest, unidentified gunmen in an unmarked vehicle opened fire on the protesters and struck and killed Ahmed Ismail Hassan. And to this date, there's been no indication that anybody has been brought to justice for his death or that there's been any credible investigation to his death. Taken together, I think that these long prison sentences, the brutal treatment of detained journalists and the stripping of their nationalities, and also the brutal murders and the lack of justice for those murders, overall would paint a very grim picture of press freedom in Bahrain and would certainly intimidate any critical independent journalists. But in addition to that, we've also increasingly documented around the region, around the world, is the spread of spyware and surveillance technology. And last year, the Toronto-based group Citizen Lab reported that a Bahraini journalist and a number of other Bahraini activists were among the targets of the NSO group's Pegasus surveillance spyware. And this kind of points to how widespread the surveillance spyware technology has become, not only in Bahrain, but in the region as well. But in particular in Bahrain, it's a bit like the last piece of the puzzle used to ultimately crack down on journalists and to ensure their silence. Taken in combination with the impunity for journalist death and the number of journalists behind bars, what we see is a complete and total picture of journalists being cowed into silence by the Bahraini authorities. As on closing, I want to kind of loop this into the broader situation where Bahrain is by no means an isolated case in the region. In fact, it reflects the trends where we see in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, very, very similar in the sense of lots of journalists behind bars, impunity for the deaths of journalists, as in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, and also seeing the region emerging as a locus for the deployment of spyware and surveillance technology against journalists. The important thing to consider about Bahrain is that the government is closely allied with the US, with the UK governments, and now, since the signing of the Abraham Accords, also with the Israeli government as well. They have very successfully cast themselves as a guarantor of security and stability, not only in Bahrain, but in the region. And they have used those alliances to burnish that image. It's imperative that the international community not let press freedom be a casualty of these alliances in the name of security and stability. I think I've gone over time, but thank you.
Thank you for that intervention, Justin. You've raised a lot of important points, especially about the coercive environment that Bahraini journalists and activists have to work in today's day and age, especially with the emergence of spyware and other coercive tools that the Bahraini government uses to try to silence or intimidate journalists who are currently behind bars as prisoners of conscience, or journalists that are still working on the ground in Bahrain. But I'll digress there in light of our Q&A. I'll next hand it over to you, Salwa.
Thank you very much. Eid Mubarak to Muslims and happy International Press Freedom Day. Thanks for the Bahrain Center for Human Rights for inviting me and organizing this very important webinar. I will not repeat what Justin has already mentioned about the journalists who are behind bars, or that we call, of course, Bahrain authorities to release them and also to investigate on the cases of journalists who were murdered. I will try to complement on other elements relating to the state of freedom of expression and mainly the legal and regulatory framework of the press freedom in Bahrain. So I will start by basic elements that we repeat usually, that freedom of expression is a fundamental human right. This is not unfortunately recognized in our region, and including in Bahrain. And freedom of press is also fundamental to a democratic society. And this is also not recognized. We sometimes consider freedom of expression and freedom of press as something that we can ignore within our societies. In order to make freedom of expression and freedom of press a reality, there must be a number of conditions that should be implemented by governments, such as a legal and regulatory environment that allows for an open and pluralistic media sector, a political will to support the sector, and rule of law to protect journalists and to protect media institutions and plurality of media, laws that ensure access to information, especially information in the public domain. The necessary also of media literacy skills among new consumers to critically analyze and sensitize the information. All these are unfortunately don't exist or partially exist in the majority of the countries of the MENA region. So the legal and regulatory framework in Bahrain is a very restrictive legal framework to freedom of expression and freedom of press. It is not in line with international standards, and namely with the Article 19 of the International Covenant of Human Rights, which stated in its paragraph 3 that freedom of expression cannot and freedom of press cannot restricted only for specific reasons in a democratic society, which are the respect of rights of reputation of others, the protection of national security or public order or public health or morals. These restrictions or these conditions are not respected in any of the journalists who were arrested. Journalists are arrested simply for expressing themselves and doing their job. The regulatory framework, it doesn't exist. So international standards require from governments to establish independent regulatory and self-regulatory framework and institutions for media sectors. This unfortunately doesn't exist in the majority of the MENA countries. The only countries which have independent or partially independent media regulatory institutions are Tunisia and Morocco, and these institutions are already suffering from interference, and their independence is in the majority of cases menaced. Press councils, which are the institutions that self-regulate journalists' work without any interference from legal approach, they are not also existing in any of the countries except from in Morocco, a press council which was established legally, which is not in line with international standards, and also in Tunisia, and it is a very fragile institution within a very very complicated political context. In Bahrain, since 2017, Bahrain authorities have banned all independent media in the country, and dissolved all significant opposition groups. Authorities failed to hold officials accountable for torture or ill treatments. Oversight mechanisms are not independent of the government. So if justice is not independent, and if regulatory institutions don't exist, so this means immediately for a situation, an environment that not enable freedom of press and freedom of expression. Independent media cannot operate in Bahrain. Since I think the suspension of Al-Wasat in the country in 2017, foreign journalists rarely have access to Bahrain and human rights and public information. Bahrain also further restrict online content. So freedom of expression and freedom of press, according to Article 19 of Human Rights Declaration and the International Covenant of Human Rights, mean the request and the circulation of all information with all means. But online content in Bahrain is in general restricted by amending the press law to require that news and broadcasting sites register and obtain Ministry of Information Affairs approvals, which is not in line with international standards and good practices, and to obtain electronic media form from publishing content that conflicts with national interest or the constitution, which is also not in line with the paragraph 3 of the Article 19 of the International Covenant of Human Rights. The broad situation in the MENA region is also very alarming, including in the only experience that showed a will to pass to a more democratic country, which is Tunisia. So now Tunisia experience to pass to democracy is facing a lot of problems, unfortunately, and the broad region, mainly within the COVID-19 restrictions, to stop the virus. All the governments have failed to fight against the virus, and in the same time protect freedom of expression and freedom of press. And we have seen that in the majority of the cases, governments in the MENA region, including in Bahrain, have used the COVID-19 as an excuse to restrict more freedom of expression and freedom of press. In addition to that, we have seen also that countering hate speech and countering and fighting fake news have also used it as an excuse to adopt additional laws and additional regulations to repress freedom of expression and freedom of press. Freedom of press cannot flourish in an environment that not enable freedom of association and freedom of expression as a whole. So if the environment is restricting freedom of expression and freedom of association, so the legal framework in Bahrain, in the many countries of the MENA region, don't allow for a citizen to create easily to create easily associations and contribute to the national debate about the national and public interests. And if the environment doesn't allow for freedom of expression and freedom of association, freedom of press will be, of course, very fragile, and will not flourish, and will not be independent, and will not be pluralistic. So in this day, International Day of Freedom of Press, so we recall all the governments in the MENA region to respect freedom of press, freedom of expression, and recognize the access to information which is held by public authorities, because access to information is an element and a strong condition to allow press freedom. So the majority also of the countries in the MENA region don't have access to information law, and if this law exists, it is it is adopted with, it is very weak, or it is adopted with a lot of restrictions within it, or it is adopted and there are other many laws which restrict access to information held by public institutions and public authorities. So just to conclude that, unfortunately, the state of freedom of press and freedom of expression in the MENA region is going more and more down compared to the other countries and other regions. So the COVID-19 situation 2 years ago, and now also with what is happening in the MENA region in terms of geopolitics and interference in many countries by other countries. So the situation of freedom of expression, the situation of media institutions and journalists is more and more very difficult to work easily. And this led to journalists to be behind bars, or to work in a very difficult situation and very difficult conditions, including also their bad social and economic situation in many of the countries of the MENA region, where journalists are working in very bad economic and social situation caused by the economic and social situation of the countries, or by the restrictions of access to financial and public funding by the authorities. Thanks.
Many thanks for your comments, Salwa. I really appreciated that you started off by affirming that the freedom of expression is a fundamental human rights, as is that it's fundamental to democratic societies. You know, the UN Human Rights Commissioner spoke and made a comment just a few days ago that a free and independent press is one of the best tools that we have to not only combat disinformation, but to fight and to promote and protect human rights. And so that's really important. But another comment that I really appreciated was, you know, the international frameworks that apply here. And that's not just for the media sector, but also the oversight mechanisms for human rights, but also the judiciary, right? The human rights situation, the freedom of expression situation is not black and white. All of these different frameworks and different situations and circumstances tie in together. For example, one of our former BCHR presidents, he was imprisoned for some of the tweets that he had posted. And there were a number of international NGOs that commented of the lack of fair and just judicial processes that took place with that trial. Like Justin said, there is a number of national security laws and anti-state laws that are arbitrarily placed against journalists and activists in Bahrain. And so I think that's very important. Next, we'll turn it over to you, Matthew.
Well, thanks so much, Anthony, and thanks also to my fellow panelists and colleagues for your really valuable comments. For those who don't know, IFX is a global network of over 120 member organizations that promote and defend freedom of expression and information as a fundamental human right worldwide. And I'm actually happy to note that this includes all of the amazing organizations on this panel. So from this perspective, I'll focus my remarks today on how the situation in Bahrain is reflective of the global challenges to press freedom, and more specifically for those who seek to defend it. I'll also discuss a little bit some of the innovative and collaborative ways that CSOs, journalists, and their allies can push back against these really harrowing trends. So worldwide, we see governments taking pages out of the same playbook to repress independent media and civil society voices. Take the example of Bahrain's so-called press law, which rather than serving to ensure a free and sustainable media ecosystem that reflects the plurality of views within Bahraini society, it's instead regularly invoked to shut down media outlets, to prevent reports from abroad from entering the country, and it gives the government a tool to crush dissent by criminalizing criticism of the king or government bodies. Similarly, the High Commission for Media and Communication, rather than liberalizing the country's media policy environment as it was intended, has only introduced more restrictive regulations, acting as yet another arm of government repression. And as content moves increasingly online, Bahrain's anti-cybercrime legislation has enhanced the press law in its ability to block websites, take down information, and prosecute journalists and defenders. Government use of surveillance technology has also helped to monitor, intimidate, and further target journalists, as seen through the Pegasus revelations and other documented instances. With these examples are echoes of contexts around the world. Legislation, whether intended to counter terrorism, cybercrime, or regulate the media, are instead weaponized to target journalists and rights defenders. IFEX member organizations who work to protect the rights of journalists in several countries have themselves been the targets of such legislation in countries like Myanmar, Belarus, Egypt, and of course in Bahrain itself. And like in Bahrain, these legislative attacks are frequently accompanied by the demonization of independent media and its defenders through accusations of terrorism, extremism, or other charges. Likewise, the capture or astroturfing of supposedly independent regulatory and judicial bodies has become increasingly common, turning institutions that would otherwise serve to uphold the pillars of democracy and civic space into tools that snuff them out. In too many cases, we've seen how the courts allow and actively contribute to the perversion of the rule of law, rubber stamping decisions that have led to the dissolution of IFEX member organizations, travel bans, exile, and even imprisonment of their staff. Unscrupulous companies have sold spyware, malware, and other surveillance technology to repressive governments around the world, with little concern for how this technology is turned on journalists and press freedom defenders. IFEX member organizations are increasingly documenting and reporting on the ways that this technology is being used to block information and silence critical reporting in the MENA region and beyond. So what does this all mean for press freedom, and why is it important? It means that rather than reporting on critical issues needed for citizens to be informed and engaged, journalists are deterred from certain stories or forced to report government narratives. It means that the flood of mis and disinformation polluting our news feeds goes unchecked and unchallenged. That citizens are paralyzed, mistrustful, and unable to access reliable, accurate, fact-checked information that helps inform the decisions that shape their lives and societies. In Bahrain specifically, it has meant that discussions of the country's economic perils, relationships with its neighbors, and social protests have been ignored, misreported, or infused with sectarian animosity. In other words, it means that a healthy civic space is imperiled and cannot thrive without press freedom. Civic space needs nurturing and defending now more than ever. But thankfully, civil society organizations around the world are finding creative and determined ways to overcome these challenges in collaboration with the media. They defend the media. They provide them with accurate information so they can fulfill their role holding the powerful to account, and even partner with them on projects to ensure the integrity of information that we rely on. For example, fact-checking initiatives are working to counter the proliferation of fake news, misinformation, and propaganda in real time. The training of journalists ensures that they can more safely and effectively report the news in the face of legal, digital, and physical threats. New flexible funding initiatives for independent media and civil society organizations defending their rights are overcoming government restrictions on resourcing or the toxic revenue model driving problems on social media. Support to exiled journalists and media outlets who have been forced to flee their homes are ensuring they can continue to live and report from abroad. Collaborative campaigning and advocacy is taking a multi-stakeholder approach, building relationships and mobilizing the international community through initiatives like the Media Freedom Coalition or raising cases of attacks at the UN and other international bodies. Finally, the issue of impunity is being addressed through sustained long-term advocacy, strategic litigation, and even parallel civil society investigations. So although daunting, the news isn't all bad. Civil society organizations are helping to turn the tide against those who seek to squelch media freedom, civic space, and our right to information. But we must remain diligent and clear-eyed. We must especially continue to stand with journalists, human rights defenders, and our other colleagues working under the most challenging odds in Bahrain and anywhere else that media freedom finds itself most at risk. So thanks very much. I'll conclude there and pass it back to Anthony.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. And for giving this conversation a positive light. We always need that in every one of our panels. But I really appreciated how you tied the freedom of expression to civic space, because a lot of the reforms that we talk about in civic space, and not just for freedom of press or freedom of expression, is needed with a free press. And so we can't have that without accurate reporting that shines a light on the places in society that we need reform and to help citizens meaningfully engage in their communities, whether it's reporting on abuse of security forces or discrimination against women or marginalized communities in Bahrain, accurate reporting is essential to that civic space and for reform to take place at all. And last but not least, I'll turn it over to Karen.
Thank you so much, Anthony. It's always hard going at the end of a panel because definitely some of the points I was going to make have already been covered a little bit by the other panelists. So I'll try and be pretty brief so we can get to the discussion portion as well. So quickly, just a little bit of background. I work currently as the Director of Free Expression at Risk Programs at PEN America. And PEN America itself basically stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and around the world. We were founded 100 years ago this year, and we're the largest of more than 100 centers that make up the PEN International Network. We work via advocacy, individual case assistance, research, and to ensure that people everywhere have the freedom to create literature, to convey information and ideas, to express their views, and to access the views, ideas, and literature of others. I'll talk quickly just about sort of, I would say, the global picture for free expression. For the last 3 years, PEN America has produced a Freedom to Write Index, which really looks at the numbers of writers around the world, writers, academics, and public intellectuals who are being imprisoned, and also looks at some of the trends about why writers are imprisoned around the world. And that the recent index, which we just released a few weeks ago, found that in 2021, at least 277 writers in all geographic regions of the world were unjustly imprisoned or held in detention in connection with their writing or other exercise of free expression. And similar to other organizations, Justin has talked about the CPJ numbers, but we've seen that this represents a significant increase over the last 3 years when we documented just 238 cases. And so the trends are definitely, I would say, negative on a global scale in terms of writers being targeted for their expression. Over half of these, the total number, were also jailed during the last 3 years. We found that over a fifth of all of these writers, that's at least 62, were serving sentences of 10 or more years in prison. And that if you look regionally, countries in the Middle East and North Africa jailed nearly 30% of the 2021 total. Now, why is this worrying? As the other speakers have also alluded to, PEN America considers free expression a foundational right. It's enshrined in the Article 19 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we really see it as an essential precursor to enable the fight for realizing any other rights, such as women's rights, workers' rights, or the rights of racial, ethnic, and religious minority groups. Writers and journalists often play a key role in guaranteeing our collective ability to imagine alternative visions of reality, to provide authentic, homegrown voices that inspire resistance, to speak truth to power, and to hold governments and other powerful societal actors to account. When a writer is jailed, it impacts not just the individual and their families, but in many cases, it deprives also the broader society of their words and ideas. So it's a twofold sort of impact that we see. The others, I think, have talked about the sort of very dire situation for free expression and human rights generally in Bahrain, and we definitely, have seen this as well. I would say that the media and expression environment is actually so restricted that there are fewer cases these days because it's just almost impossible for people to express themselves freely without fear of repercussions. And there's a wide range of laws in Bahrain used to target expression, from the penal code to national security laws to the media regulation laws, and also particular laws that focus on online expression, which was at one point sort of the last relatively open area. And these laws are constantly being amended and actually made worse. Some of the last amendments to the press laws in 2020 added more prohibitions in terms of what writers and journalists could or couldn't cover safely. So it's the situation, I think, has been very dire for at least a decade, but we haven't really seen any positive movement. In fact, it's only, I would say, gotten worse in the last few years. Now, there are a number of nonprofit organizations and advocacy groups that have been trying unsuccessfully to create change within the country. And it's despite the efforts of many of these groups, we really haven't seen much progress for some of the reasons I think that have already been touched on briefly, and maybe we can get into a little bit more in the discussion. portion of the event. In terms of the PEN network, our advocacy in Bahrain has really, for the most part, revolved around the case that's already been mentioned of Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Singas, who's a blogger, academic, and activist. He is currently serving a life sentence for his peaceful role in the 2011 pro-democracy uprisings, and he was charged with plotting to topple the government after participating in peaceful protests. As noted, he is on a hunger strike. His health was declining severely before that hunger strike, and now it's, I would say, really a very dire situation. And so that's really the case that we've been focusing on most intently as part of the PEN network. If you look sort of globally, we did in our index this past year look at the number of writers around the world who are serving life or effective life sentences. And so it's not, as common as one would think. We counted 11 cases of writers in this situation, so he's one of only 11 around the world. The others are 2 in China each and Turkey, and then 7 in Eritrea, which occurred in the context of a crackdown in 2001. Many of those writers are serving effective life sentences. These writers are paying the steepest possible price for their peaceful free expression, and we believe that their cases deserve our steady attention and support. So we have been doing sort of, I would say, steady, regular advocacy in conjunction with a number of other groups on Dr. Al-Singas's case, including, trying to push with the U.S. government to really sort of make statements about his case and to urge, that they make free expression and human rights a priority in their discussions with Bahrain. Unfortunately, this hasn't really happened. In recent meetings about a year ago, between the Bahraini and U.S. government, although groups including PEN America were engaging in advocacy on these cases and the broader issues, official U.S. government statements basically underscore the importance and strength of the U.S. Bahrain relationship, and did not really focus on prioritizing human rights. So I do think all of us need to keep up our joint advocacy initiatives and pressure on Western governments. It is a very tough nut to crack, but I think it's essential that we really, keep the focus up on these egregious individual cases, such as Dr. Al-Singas, and on the broad crackdown and restrictive conditions that continue to really plague Bahrain. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen. We have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. I'm really looking for this discussion, and so we'll just jump right into that. The first question I have is for Justin, but also for the broader group, so everyone can feel free to jump in. But Justin, you mentioned that there were a number of deaths. There were 3 deaths of journalists, murders of journalists back in 2011, 2012. How do we reconcile with the fact that there has been impunity for over a decade with regard to these murders? And as Karen was mentioning, the long-term advocacy that is needed for some of the cases and the sentences that were passed down from 2011 and 2012. What can we do about that, and how do we reconcile with the fact that it's taken so long and we have not yet received that accountability and justice that should have been presented earlier?
That's a great question. And I think that this dilemma of how to seek accountability for these murders of journalists with impunity is also really a pressing question with a global scale. And certainly it's one that we see in the region as well, with Jamal Khashoggi's murder, with the, for example, murder of Sardash Osman in Iraqi Kurdistan, which we released a report about yesterday. Specifically in the case of Bahrain, I think, earlier during my intervention, I mentioned Bahrain's international alliances and relationships with the US, with the UK, with other regional global actors. And I think that that's something where the pressure from these countries and from these institutions that are allied with Bahrain really can and will make a really, really huge difference. I mean, speaking as someone who works for a US-based organization, I think that we have seen this for a number of years with the United States across administrations, where there is this reluctance to bring up human rights abuses, press freedom abuses, with the Bahraini government, with other governments in the region, for fear of alienating allies and threatening the stability and the security of the region. It's something that has been a preoccupation with the US government under a number of different administrations, and it's something that the Bahraini government, I believe, has taken note of. And I think that what we have seen in the region, other countries in the region, is that when individuals are named, when cases are named, that's when we see that movement towards justice, however incremental that may be. If the US Secretary of State names a detained journalist, then oftentimes we will, not always, but sometimes see that journalist being released shortly thereafter. I mean, pressure from allies does make a difference. I think in terms of the accountability for the murders of these 3 journalists, it's something that should be raised repeatedly. It should be raised by the US, it should be raised by the UK, it should be raised at the UN as well during the UN Human Rights Council sessions. It should be something where we say, look, there's been a decade that's passed. There has still not been any accountability, any meaningful steps towards justice in these murders, and we are not going to let these murders be forgotten. I think that's essential that all allied countries and international institutions around the world keep up that pressure and that spotlight on Bahrain to let them know that these cases are not going to be forgotten, not just in terms of pressing for accountability, whether under the current or any future leadership in Bahrain, but also to dignify the lives and the work of these journalists as well, who pay the ultimate price for doing work in a very risky situation. I think that's essential, and I think that that's something that can happen on all sorts of different levels. Certainly on a high level with governments and with international institutions that have relationships with Bahrain, but also on the level of global civil society as well. As has been pointed out many times before, Bahrain has for a number of years hosted the F1 tournament, despite F1 drivers themselves increasingly raising concerns about the human rights situation there. That's something where also we see not just governments and high-level officials, but ordinary citizens, people who participate in civil society having a role to play. The pressure should continue, it should be nonstop, and it should come from all levels of civil society and institutions.
Thank you for that. I want to touch on one of the latter points you made about civil society and what civil society can do in Bahrain, given the coercive environment that we know they're operating in, especially the number of ways that the government has tried to intimidate journalists through revoking their nationality, through imprisonment, through intimidation, means like that. So for Matthew, could you give us some insight about what civil society can do in light of this environment to try to keep up the pressure and continue their advocacy?
Yeah, I think in these situations where local civil society organizations are under so much pressure, whether it's legal pressure, physical threats, and just the psychological pressure of constantly being surveilled, constantly being persecuted, it takes an incredible toll. And I think what we've seen in the IFEX network is that the international solidarity and support from civil society abroad is essential. Whether it's organizations like CPJ, Article 19, and PEN America continuing to keep individual cases in the spotlight, such as those that have been discussed here, or whether it's just voicing support for those civil society organizations. I think, especially given what we see quite often, all too often, with these organizations being labeled as extremists or in support of terrorist organizations, reaffirming their legitimacy and the important work that they do has been crucial. And I think a really kind of amazing example that we've seen of this recently was just a couple of days ago when, for example, the Belarusian Association of Journalists was awarded the Kano Press Freedom Prize, and they're an organization that has been dissolved within the country because of such accusations. But it makes it all the more important that they continue to receive support from civil society colleagues, but also from friendly governments, intergovernmental organizations, and I think also just collaboration with these organizations too, given the restrictions on resourcing and funding and just the room to operate at the local level. Means that collaborative relationships between local organizations and regional and international organizations, whether it's pooling resources, pooling funds, whether it's exchanging kind of expertise, amplifying each other's campaigns, raising their cases and the issues with key contacts at the intergovernmental level or with allied governments. That kind of support is also really essential. I think also legal support too, because unfortunately, as mentioned, we frequently see these organizations targeted with travel bans or with detentions and others. So I think having a source of support for to push back against those legal charges is also quite crucial. So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of covers it from my end.
Yeah, and actually, if I could jump and just add on to that, Anthony, I totally agree with what Matthew's saying. I mean, we find that usually it's obviously very powerful and effective to, whenever possible, have the family members of a detained writer speaking out, or activists from a local NGO from the country itself who have directly experienced the types of restrictions or repression. I mean, that's always, I would say, the preference to hear from the voices directly affected and who have, personal experience. But in these types of cases where there are such, severe restrictions on travel and the ability to operate, I think it's really essential, to form these partnerships and alliances between, Bahrain-focused organizations and some of the bigger or more internationally focused groups who can really work together and push for advocacy on all levels. And obviously, whenever possible, sort of bringing the voices of Bahrainis who have directly experienced the repression to the foreground. But in such restrictive environments, it's absolutely essential for organizations to really have these cross-cutting alliances and partnerships.
Absolutely. Thank you both for those remarks. I want to jump over to Salwa, who raised the point of spyware. That's something that everyone has talked about as well. But given the emergence of Pegasus from the NSO group, the use of spyware and surveillance technologies is not new in Bahrain. But this one is particularly pervasive. And I'm just wondering, what are the steps forward that civil society and the international community can do to counteract this? Given that many of the activists who are targeted by the spyware don't even know that they have been infected, what can we do to help protect these activists and journalists?
Thanks very much for the good question. I think first of all that we need technical support from the organizations that have this expertise to check if their mobile phones, for example, are or not tracked. Because I have seen lately in Jordan that a number of human rights defenders and journalists where also their mobile phones are under surveillance, and they were not aware. And we have seen this also in other countries of the region. I think the first step is to check when we know that journalists or human rights defenders who are in the front lines and might be targeted. We have to check, and also the other thing, because we don't know what are the countries. I think Bahrain is one of the countries that have used so this technology from NOSO. But we don't know all the countries in the region. We know some of them, but we don't know all of them. And for the countries where we have discovered that they have used this technology against human rights defenders and journalists, we didn't hear any official position or any official information by the governments to say, apart Morocco, who they ignored and they denied completely. But for example, in Jordan, public authorities didn't release any official communique to say what happened and who is involved from the countries. So first of all, to know which are the countries who are using this technology. So check for the human rights defenders and journalists who are in the front lines, who are criticizing regularly the government practices, and do pressure so that this is investigated, and to put those involved into account.
Thank you very much for that, Salwa. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but I wish we could pose more questions to everyone and have a longer discussion about this, because there's so many good topics that we touched on today. Justin, about the long-term advocacy and the long-term oversight over cases and cases of impunity that we've seen in Bahrain, and from Matthew and Karen about the need for Western governments to put pressure on these cases and these issues as proponents of human rights, as proponents of the freedom of expression, and from Salwa about the need to protect journalists and activists from pervasive technologies like Pegasus that we've seen in the past year. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. This has been a great discussion. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
BCHR.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank you. Bye.